October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar, Philippines, a small American escort carrier group, designated Taffy 3, suddenly found itself face to face with the most powerful surface fleet the Imperial Japanese Navy could muster. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers. The Americans had 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts and 6 escort carriers with aircraft designed for ground support, not naval combat. The odds were not just unfavorable, they were catastrophic. By every calculation, every tactical doctrine, every principle of naval warfare, Taffy 3 should have been annihilated within 30 minutes. Yet, 2.5 hours later, the Japanese fleet, confused, bloodied, and psychologically shattered, retreated in disarray. At the heart of this impossible victory stood one ship, the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer that charged alone into the teeth of the enemy armada and fought with such ferocious audacity that Japanese commanders believed they were facing a much larger American force. What the Johnston did that morning defied not just military logic, but the very laws of survival itself. The Warrior's Creed. When Doctrine Meets Destiny, the Pacific Theater, October 1944. The United States Navy was executing Operation King II, the liberation of the Philippines, a campaign that would determine the fate of the entire Pacific War. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet had been lured north by a Japanese decoy force, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Through this gap, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the most formidable concentration of Japanese naval power remaining in the war, steamed toward the vulnerable American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. Standing between Kurita's armada and the defenseless troop transports was Taffy 3, a unit never designed for surface combat. Commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, CVEs, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. These escort carriers, nicknamed Jeep carriers or derisively combustible, vulnerable, expendable, carried aircraft meant for anti-submarine warfare and close air support, not fleet engagement. Their maximum speed was 18 knots. Their armor was virtually non-existent. Their largest guns were 5-inch deck weapons. Kurita's fleet, by contrast, included the battleships Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna. The Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons and mounted 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever put to sea. Each of her shells weighed 3,200 pounds and could penetrate 30 inches of steel armor at 20 miles. The heavy cruisers Haguro, Chokai, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Tony each carried 10 8-inch guns. Against this steel avalanche, the Americans possessed nothing heavier than the 5-inch guns on their destroyers, weapons designed to shoot down aircraft, not engage capital ships. The strategic context was dire. If Kurita's fleet reached the landing beaches, it would slaughter thousands of American troops and potentially reverse the entire Philippine campaign. The nearest American heavy units, Halsey's battleships and fleet carriers, were 300 miles north, chasing the Japanese decoy force. No help would arrive for hours, perhaps days. Admiral Sprague's carriers could not outrun Kurita's battleships. They could not outfight them. By every rational assessment, they were doomed. At 06:45 hours on October 25th, lookouts aboard Taffy 3's ships spotted the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships on the horizon. Within minutes, massive geysers of water, dyed red, yellow, green, and purple by Japanese spotting charges, began erupting around the American carriers as Kurita's heavy guns opened fire at maximum range. The shells screamed overhead with a sound one sailor described as freight trains being dragged through the sky. Aboard the USS Johnston, DD-557, Commander Ernest E. Evans received the contact report. A Cherokee from Oklahoma, Evans had addressed his crew at the Johnston's commissioning ceremony with words that would define the ship's character. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Not a single man had left. Evans was a warrior by instinct and training. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1931, served on destroyers throughout the interwar period, and absorbed the aggressive destroyer doctrine that emphasized speed, audacity, and close-range torpedo attacks. But what he was about to do went far beyond doctrine. Standard procedure called for destroyers to lay smoke screens to conceal the carriers, then wait for coordinated orders before launching torpedo attacks. The idea of a single destroyer charging alone into a battleship formation was not just unconventional, it was suicidal. Yet as Evans watched the colored splashes walk toward the carriers, as he calculated the closing rate and the time until Kurita's guns found their range, he made a decision that would echo through naval history. Without waiting for orders, without coordinating with the other destroyers, he turned to his officer of the deck and gave an order that defied every principle of self-preservation. "All ahead flank, commence making smoke, all hands to general quarters, prepare to attack." The Johnston's engines roared to full power, driving the 2,700-ton destroyer to 35 knots. Black oil smoke poured from her stacks as she laid a protective screen between the carriers and the enemy. But Evans wasn't just covering the retreat, he was attacking. The Johnston's crew raced to battle stations with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. They knew the odds. A Fletcher-class destroyer carried 10 torpedo tubes, 5 5-inch guns, and armor measured in fractions of an inch. The Yamato's belt armor was 16 inches thick. A direct hit from the Johnston's guns would barely scratch the battleship's paint. A single hit from the Yamato's main battery would vaporize the destroyer. Lieutenant Robert Hagan, the Johnston's gunnery officer, later recalled, "We all knew it was a death ride. But Commander Evans had this quality. When he gave an order, you believed it was the right thing to do, even if it meant dying. He radiated this absolute confidence that we could hurt them, that we could make a difference." As the Johnston charged through her own smoke screen toward the enemy fleet, Evans addressed his crew over the intercom. "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The Johnston's fire control radar locked onto the lead heavy cruiser, the Kumano, at a range of 18,000 yards, 9 miles. Evans held his course, closing the distance, waiting for the optimal torpedo launch range. Japanese shells began falling around the Johnston. A near miss lifted the destroyer's stern out of the water. Another exploded 50 yards to port, sending shrapnel screaming across the deck. At 10,000 yards, Evans ordered, "Fire torpedoes!" 10 Mark 15 torpedoes leapt from the Johnston's tubes, their compressed air propulsion systems leaving white wakes as they raced toward the Japanese formation at 46 knots. The torpedoes would take 4 minutes to reach their targets, 4 minutes during which the Johnston would be fully exposed to the enemy's guns, unable to maneuver radically without disrupting the torpedo solution. The Japanese fleet reacted with shock. Kurita's battle plan had anticipated air attacks from the American carriers, but not a surface attack from a lone destroyer. The Kumano, seeing the torpedo wakes, turned hard to starboard to comb the tracks. The heavy cruiser Suzuya followed. The maneuver disrupted the Japanese formation's cohesion, forcing ships to break their firing solutions on the carriers to avoid the torpedoes. At EO 7:10 hours, 3 explosions rippled along the Kumano's hull. The Johnston's torpedoes had struck home, blowing off the cruiser's bow and flooding her forward compartments. The Kumano slewed to a halt, dead in the water, her speed reduced from 35 knots to 0 in seconds. She would take no further part in the battle. The Johnston's crew erupted in cheers, but their celebration was short-lived. Having expended her torpedoes, the destroyer was now within gun range of the entire Japanese fleet, and Kurita's ships were concentrating their fire on this impudent attacker. Evans ordered a hard turn to port, making smoke, trying to escape back into the protective haze. At 07:20 hours, the Johnston's luck ran out. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo struck the destroyer in rapid succession. The first shell penetrated the aft engine room, killing every man inside instantly and reducing the Johnston's speed by half. The second shell destroyed the after-fire room and ruptured fuel tanks, sending burning oil cascading through the ship. The third shell struck the bridge, killing or wounding nearly everyone there. Commander Evans was blown off his feet, his clothes shredded by shrapnel, 2 fingers of his left hand severed. Blood poured from dozens of wounds. The Johnston's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagan, found Evans pulling himself upright, his face a mask of blood and determination. "Bridge still manned," Evans said through gritted teeth. "Maintain fire. Continue the attack." With half her engineering plant destroyed, fires raging below decks, and her bridge a shambles, the Johnston limped into her own smoke screen. By every measure she should have withdrawn, should have tried to save herself. She had already done more than anyone could expect. Crippled a heavy cruiser, disrupted the enemy formation, bought precious minutes for the carriers. But Ernest Evans was not finished, and neither was the USS Johnston. The destroyer's damage control parties fought the fires with a desperation born of necessity. Pharmacists' mates moved through the wreckage, treating the wounded where they lay, because there was no time to move them to sick bay. In the forward engine room, Chief Machinist's mate Joe Gatlin and his black gang kept the remaining boiler running at maximum pressure, coaxing 17 knots from an engine that should have been capable of only 10 in its damaged state. In the gun mounts, crews continued loading and firing, even as Japanese shells fell around them like steel rain. Gun Captain Cletus Oberg, manning Mount 51, later described the scene. "We could see the Japanese ships clearly now, these massive grey shapes with their guns flashing. Every time they fired, you knew one of those shells had your name on it, but we kept firing back. What else could we do?" The Johnston emerged from the smoke screen at 07:30 hours, her guns still firing, her battle flag still flying. She had been reduced to half speed, was on fire in 3 places, had lost all power to her aft gun mounts, and had suffered over 40 casualties. But she was still fighting. Admiral Sprague, watching from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, later wrote, "The Johnston's attack was the most courageous act I witnessed in 30 years of naval service. Commander Evans took his ship into harm's way without hesitation, without orders, and without hope of survival. He bought us time to launch aircraft, time to make smoke, time to run. Without the Johnston sacrifice, Taffy 3 would have been destroyed in the first 30 minutes of the battle. But the sacrifice was not yet complete. The battle was only beginning, and the Johnston, battered, burning but unbowed, would charge into the enemy fleet 2 more times before the morning was over. As the destroyer maneuvered through the smoke and chaos, Evans surveyed the damage and calculated his options. His ship was crippled but not dead. His crew was bloodied but not broken, and the Japanese fleet was still closing on the carriers, still threatening to break through and slaughter the landing forces. Ernest Evans made his decision. The Johnston would attack again, into the maelstrom. When survival becomes secondary to duty, the battle off Samar had transformed into a chaotic melee unlike any naval engagement in history. By 07:50 hours, the sea was obscured by a combination of natural rain squalls and the thick, oily smoke laid down by the American destroyers and destroyer escorts. Visibility fluctuated wildly. One moment clear enough to see 10 miles, the next reduced to a few hundred yards. In this murky twilight world, the USS Johnston continued her impossible fight. Commander Evans, his left hand wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, had moved command operations to the aft steering station after the bridge hit. Communication throughout the ship was reduced to sound-powered phones and runners, young sailors who sprinted through smoke-filled passageways carrying orders and damage reports. The Johnston's radar had been destroyed, her fire control systems were operating on auxiliary power, and her gyro compass was malfunctioning. Gunnery solutions now depended on visual sighting and the experience of gun captains who had trained for years for exactly this moment. The tactical situation remained desperate. Admiral Kurita's center force, despite the Johnston's torpedo attack and the growing swarm of aircraft from Taffy 3's carriers, continued pressing toward the American escort carriers. The Japanese heavy cruisers, faster and more maneuverable than the battleships, had begun to pull ahead of the main formation, closing the range to the fleeing American ships. The cruiser Tone had already scored hits on the escort carrier Gambier Bay, and the carrier was slowing, trailing smoke. At 800 hours, Admiral Sprague made a decision that would define the character of the entire engagement. Rather than continue fleeing and hoping his carriers could somehow outrun the Japanese cruisers, an impossibility given the speed differential, he ordered his 3 remaining destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts to conduct a torpedo attack against the pursuing enemy cruisers. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. But it was also the only chance to save the carriers. The order crackled over the radio. "Small boys, attack!" The destroyers Hole and Heerman, along with the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, immediately turned toward the enemy and began their attack runs. The Johnston, though not technically part of the ordered attack group and already heavily damaged, needed no prompting. Evans had been waiting for exactly this moment. "All ahead flank," Evans ordered, though the Johnston could barely manage 17 knots. "Target the lead cruiser. All guns, commence firing." What followed was a scene of such concentrated violence that survivors would struggle for decades to adequately describe it. 7 small American warships charged directly into a formation of 6 heavy cruisers and multiple destroyers, their 5-inch guns firing as fast as crews could load them, their torpedo tubes trained on targets that outweighed them 10 to 1. The Johnston, despite her damage, led the charge. Lieutenant Robert Hagen had managed to restore power to 3 of the 5 main gun mounts, and these weapons now fired in a continuous rhythm, load, fire, sending 54-pound shells toward the Japanese cruisers at a rate of 15 rounds per minute per gun. At ranges that closed from 10,000 yards to 5,000 yards, even 5-inch guns could do damage to cruiser superstructures, and the Johnston's gunners were among the best in the fleet. Ensign John Wukowitz, manning the forward fire control station, later recalled, "We were so close I could see Japanese sailors on their decks. I could see their gun flashes, see their shells coming at us. It was like being in a knife fight in a phone booth. There was no room for error, no time to think. You just did your job and hoped you'd live another 30 seconds. The Johnston's guns found their mark on the heavy cruiser Haguro. Shells smashed into the cruiser's bridge, destroying her fire control systems and killing several officers. More hits struck her forward turrets, jamming the mechanisms and putting 2 of her main guns out of action. The Haguro, stung by this unexpected resistance, turned her full attention to the Johnston. What happened next was a demonstration of the brutal mathematics of naval warfare. The Haguro mounted 10 8-inch guns, each firing a 260-pound shell capable of penetrating 5 inches of armor at 10,000 yards. The Johnston's hull plating was 3/8 of an inch thick. When the Haguro's guns spoke, the result was catastrophic. At 08:20 hours, a salvo of 3 8-inch shells struck the Johnston amidships. The first shell penetrated the forward engine room, which had somehow remained operational until that moment, and exploded among the boilers. Superheated steam at 600 degrees Fahrenheit filled the compartment, killing Chief Machinist's mate Gatlin and his entire watch section in seconds. The second shell struck the forward ammunition magazine, but by a miracle failed to detonate. Had it exploded, the Johnston would have been blown in half. The third shell tore through the ship's galley and berthing spaces, killing a dozen men and starting new fires. The Johnston shuddered to a halt, dead in the water. All power was lost. The guns fell silent. In the sudden quiet, broken only by the screams of the wounded and the roar of nearby explosions, it seemed the destroyer's fight was finally over. But in the aft steering station, Ernest Evans refused to accept defeat. "Get me damage reports," he ordered. "Find out what still works." The reports came back within minutes, delivered by runners who had crawled through smoke-filled passages. Forward engine room destroyed, all hands lost. After engine room flooded, abandoned. All main power lost, auxiliary power at 15%. 3 gun mounts still operational on local control. Torpedo tubes empty, hull breached in 4 locations. Casualties estimated at 30% of crew. By any standard, the Johnston was finished. She had no propulsion, no centralized fire control, no radar, and was taking on water. The correct order, the only sane order, was to abandon ship while the crew still could. Evans gave a different order. All guns that can bear, continue firing on local control. Damage control parties, get me auxiliary power to at least 1 screw. We're not done yet. What followed was a testament to the training, discipline, and sheer bloody-minded determination of the Johnston's crew. In the forward gun mounts, crews manually trained their weapons using hand cranks, sighting through optical rangefinders, calculating firing solutions with grease pencils on plotting boards. Gun Captain Oberg's Mount 51 continued firing at the Haguro, even though each shot had to be aimed by eye, and the mount had to be manually traversed between shots, a process that normally took 30 seconds, but which Oberg's crew reduced to 15 through sheer desperation. Below decks, Lieutenant J.G. Ellsworth Welch, the assistant engineering officer, performed a miracle of damage control. With most of the engineering spaces flooded or filled with toxic smoke, Welch and a handful of volunteers crawled through a maze of wreckage to reach the after steering motor. Using emergency batteries and bypassing every safety system, they managed to restore power to the rudder and 1 propeller shaft. At dear weight 35 hours, 15 minutes after being dead in the water, the Johnston began moving again, not the 35 knots of her glory, but 5 knots, then 7, then a miraculous 10 knots as Welch's team coaxed every amp from the failing batteries. The Johnston's resurrection shocked the Japanese cruisers. The Haguro, Tone, and Chikuma had all shifted fire to other targets, assuming the destroyer was sinking. Now, impossibly, she was moving again, and her guns were still firing. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese commanders, trained in a doctrine that emphasized overwhelming force and decisive engagement, could not comprehend an enemy that refused to die, that continued attacking even when mortally wounded. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding the destroyer Yahagi in Kurita's formation, later wrote in his memoir, "The American destroyers fought with a fury we had never encountered. They came at us like samurai, accepting death, seeking only to inflict maximum damage before they fell. The small ship that we had hit repeatedly, we learned later it was the Johnston, continued fighting long after it should have sunk. It was as if the ship itself had a warrior's spirit that refused to surrender. At 8:50 hours, the Johnston's guns scored a critical hit on the heavy cruiser Chikuma. A 5-inch shell, fired at a range of just 4,000 yards, struck the cruiser's torpedo storage area. The resulting explosion was massive. Secondary detonations rippled along the Chikuma's hull as her own torpedoes cooked off. The cruiser slewed out of formation, her speed dropping, fires visible along her entire length. She would sink later that day, the only Japanese heavy cruiser lost in the battle. But the Johnston's final victory came at a terrible price. The Chikuma's sister ships, enraged by the loss, concentrated their fire on the crippled destroyer. At 09:05 hours, the Johnston was struck by a devastating barrage. At least 6 heavy shells in less than a minute. One shell destroyed the last operational gun mount. Another penetrated the ship's magazine, and this time the shell did detonate. The explosion lifted the Johnston's bow out of the water and sent a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris 200 feet into the air. Commander Evans, thrown to the deck by the blast, pulled himself up one final time. Blood ran from his ears. His uniform was in tatters. Around him, the aft steering station was a scene of carnage. Dead and wounded sailors sprawled across the deck, equipment sparking and smoking, the smell of burning flesh and cordite thick in the air. Evans looked at the men still standing, perhaps 20 sailors out of the 327 who had manned the Johnston that morning. He looked at his ship, listing 15 degrees to port, her bow nearly underwater, fires raging unchecked. He looked at the Japanese cruisers, still closing, their guns still firing. And then Ernest Evans gave his final order. "Abandon ship. All hands, abandon ship. It's been an honor serving with you." The crew began going over the side, jumping into the oil-slicked water, clinging to debris and life rafts. Many were wounded. Some were so exhausted they could barely swim. But they were alive, and they had done something extraordinary. At 09:45 hours, the USS Johnston rolled onto her port side and slid beneath the waves. She had been in continuous combat for 3 hours. She had charged alone into an enemy fleet. She had been hit by more than 40 shells from battleships and cruisers. She had crippled 2 heavy cruisers and disrupted the entire Japanese attack formation. And she had bought precious time. Time for the escort carriers to launch aircraft, time for the other destroyers to attack, time for Admiral Kurita to lose his nerve and order a retreat, just as victory was within his grasp. As the Johnston disappeared, a Japanese destroyer, the Yukikaze, passed close to the American survivors in the water. The destroyer's captain, seeing the men in the water, ordered his crew to come to attention and salute. It was an acknowledgement, warrior to warrior, of courage that transcended nationality. In the water, clinging to a piece of wreckage, Commander Ernest Evans watched his ship vanish. He had been wounded multiple times, had lost blood, and was going into shock. He would not survive the next few hours. Of the Johnston's crew, only 141 men would be rescued. 186, including Evans, would die, some in the battle, others in the water afterward. But the Johnston's sacrifice had not been in vain. At 09:25 hours, even as the destroyer was sinking, Admiral Kurita made the decision that would define the battle off Samar. Confused by the ferocious resistance, convinced he was facing a much larger American force, and shaken by the loss of 3 heavy cruisers, Kurita ordered his fleet to break off the attack and withdraw. The landing forces at Leyte Gulf were saved. The Philippine campaign would continue. And the course of the Pacific War remained unchanged. The Johnston had done the impossible. A single destroyer had charged an entire fleet and won. When the hunters became the hunted, the Japanese perspective of chaos. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, the most powerful warship ever constructed, and tried to make sense of what he was witnessing. It was 09:30 hours on October 25, 1944, and nothing about the battle unfolding before him matched his intelligence briefings, his tactical expectations, or his understanding of American naval doctrine. The confusion that gripped Kurita and his staff in those critical minutes would ultimately determine the outcome of the entire Battle of Samar, and perhaps the fate of the Philippine campaign itself. Kurita's center force had entered the battle with overwhelming advantages. His 4 battleships alone displaced more tonnage than the entire American force opposing him. His heavy cruisers outgunned anything the Americans possessed. His destroyers were among the finest in the Imperial Japanese Navy. equipped with the deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedoes that had devastated Allied fleets earlier in the war. By every calculation, by every principle of naval warfare taught at the Imperial Naval Academy at Iwo, Kurita's fleet should have annihilated the American escort carriers within 30 minutes and proceeded to slaughter the landing forces at Leyte Gulf. Yet 90 minutes into the engagement, Kurita's formation was in disarray. The heavy cruiser Kumano was dead in the water, her bow blown off by torpedoes from that first American destroyer, the one his intelligence officers had identified as the USS Johnston. The cruiser, Suzuya, was limping away from the battle, her steering damaged by near misses from American bombs. The Chikuma was on fire and sinking, victim of a catastrophic torpedo explosion. The cruiser Chokai had been hit by aircraft and was losing speed. And the American carriers, those supposedly defenseless jeep carriers, were still afloat, still launching aircraft, still fighting. Most disturbing of all was the ferocity of the American destroyer attacks. Kurita's doctrine, shaped by years of training and combat experience, held that destroyers were fragile vessels that would launch torpedoes from maximum range and then retreat behind smokescreens. They were not supposed to charge directly into battleship formations. They were not supposed to continue fighting after sustaining mortal damage. They were not supposed to display the kind of suicidal courage that Kurita associated with Japanese, not American, naval tradition. Captain Toshio Abe, Kurita's chief of staff, reviewed the damage reports with growing alarm. "Admiral, the Kumano reports she cannot make way. The Chikuma is requesting permission to withdraw. Her magazines are flooding. The Suzuya has lost steering control. And the tone reports she has expended 60% of her main battery ammunition engaging the destroyers." Kurita studied the tactical plot, trying to piece together a coherent picture from the fragmentary reports flooding into the Yamato's Combat Information Center. The Americans had laid smoke screens so dense that visual identification was nearly impossible. Radar contacts appeared and disappeared as ships moved in and out of rain squalls. Radio intercepts suggested the presence of multiple American task forces, though Kurita's intelligence had indicated only a single escort carrier group in this area. "How many American carriers have we sunk?" Kurita asked. Abe consulted his notes. "Confirmed sinkings." "None, Admiral. The Gambia Bay is heavily damaged and dead in the water. We believe she will sink shortly, but the others have evaded our fire." "How many destroyers have the Americans committed to the torpedo attacks?" "Initial reports indicated 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, Admiral, but the volume of fire and the number of torpedo tracks suggest a larger force, possibly as many as 12 to 15 destroyers. This was the critical misperception that would shape all of Kurita's subsequent decisions. In reality, only 7 American destroyers and destroyer escorts had conducted the torpedo attacks, and one of those, the Johnston, had already sunk. But in the chaos of battle, with visibility obscured by smoke and rain, with ships appearing and disappearing, with the sheer audacity of the American attacks suggesting a larger force, Kurita's staff had dramatically overestimated the opposition. The overestimation was not merely a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. Japanese naval doctrine in 1944 was built on the assumption of American caution. The U.S. Navy, in the Japanese assessment, fought with overwhelming material superiority, using long-range aircraft and superior radar to engage from safe distances. The idea that American commanders would throw destroyers into suicidal close-range attacks, that they would continue fighting when all hope of survival was lost, contradicted everything the Japanese believed about their enemy. Commander Tonosuke Otani, the Yamato's gunnery officer, reported another disturbing development. "Admiral, our main battery has fired 104 rounds at the American carriers. We have observed only 2 hits, both on the damaged carrier. The Americans are maneuvering radically and using the smoke screens effectively. At current expenditure rates, we will exhaust our armor-piercing ammunition within another hour of engagement. This was a problem Kurita had not anticipated. The Yamato's massive 18.1-inch guns had been designed to engage enemy battleships at ranges exceeding 20 miles, but the American carriers were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than battleships. They jinked and weaved, turned into and out of smoke screens, and used rain squalls for concealment. The Yamato's fire control systems, optimized for long-range engagement of large, relatively predictable targets, struggled to track the erratically maneuvering carriers. The result was a hit rate of less than 2%, a devastating waste of irreplaceable ammunition. At 09:35 hours, Kurita received a report that crystallized his growing doubts. The destroyer Yahagi, screening the northern flank of his formation, reported radar contacts consistent with a large American surface force approaching from the northeast, the direction of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. The contact report estimated 4 to 6 large ships, possibly battleships or heavy cruisers, at a range of 30 miles and closing. In reality, the radar contacts were a combination of rain squalls and a small group of American destroyers that had been detached from another task force, but Kurita had no way of knowing this. He knew that Halsey's Third Fleet included 6 fast battleships and multiple heavy cruisers, a force that could annihilate his center force if it caught him engaged with the escort carriers. He knew that his fleet had been under continuous air attack for over an hour and that his anti-aircraft ammunition was running low. He knew that he had lost 3 heavy cruisers and that several other ships were damaged. And he knew that his mission to destroy the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf was slipping away. Every minute spent engaged with these unexpectedly resilient escort carriers was a minute not spent approaching the landing beaches. Every shell expended on destroyers was a shell that could not be used against troop transports. The tactical victory he had expected to achieve in 30 minutes had turned into a grinding, costly battle of attrition that was consuming his fleet's combat power without achieving the strategic objective. Captain Abe voiced the concern that was growing in every staff officer's mind. "Admiral, if Halsey's battleships catch us here, engaged with these carriers, we will be trapped. Our fleet will be destroyed. Perhaps we should disengage, regroup, and approach Leyte Gulf from a different vector." Kurita stared at the tactical plot, his mind racing through the possibilities. The American carriers were still afloat. The destroyers were still attacking. Aircraft were still swarming around his fleet, and now, possibly, American battleships were approaching. The situation bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the Battle of Midway in 1942, when Japanese carriers had been caught at a vulnerable moment and destroyed. Kurita had not been at Midway, but every officer in the Imperial Navy knew the story, knew how quickly overwhelming advantage could turn into catastrophic defeat. At 09:45 hours, Kurita made his decision. "Signal all ships, break off the attack, formation will turn north and regroup. We will reassess the situation and determine a new approach to Leyte Gulf." The order stunned his staff. Captain Abe protested, "Admiral, the American carriers are within our grasp. The Gambier Bay is sinking. 1 more hour and we can destroy the entire group." Kurita's response revealed the depth of his confusion and the psychological impact of the American resistance. "We have been engaged for 90 minutes and have sunk only 1 carrier. The Americans have committed at least 12 destroyers to stopping us. That suggests they are protecting something important, possibly Halsey's carriers. We have lost 3 cruisers and expended a third of our ammunition. If we continue this engagement and Halsey's battleships arrive, we will be destroyed without accomplishing our mission. We will disengage, evade the American surface force, and approach Leyte Gulf from the north." The order went out at 09:50 hours. Across Kurita's formation, Japanese ships turned away from the American carriers and began steaming north. On the bridge of the heavy cruiser Tone, Captain Haruo Mayuzumi watched the American carriers disappear into the smoke and rain and felt a profound sense of frustration. "We had them," he said to his executive officer. "We had them beaten and we're running away." But Kurita's decision was not simply a failure of nerve. It was the culmination of a systematic breakdown in Japanese intelligence, doctrine, and command psychology. The Japanese had entered the battle expecting to face a demoralized, cautious enemy. Instead, they had encountered an opponent who fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness, who sacrificed ships and men without hesitation, who turned every tactical disadvantage into an opportunity for attack. The Johnston's charge, in particular, had shattered Japanese assumptions. A single destroyer, already crippled, had continued attacking long after any rational commander would have withdrawn. It had crippled the Kumano, damaged the Haguro, and contributed to the destruction of the Chikuma. More importantly, it had created an impression of American strength and determination that far exceeded the actual forces engaged. Lieutenant Commander Hideo Fukumoto, an intelligence officer on Kurita's staff, later wrote in his diary, "We could not understand the American destroyers. By all logic, they should have withdrawn after launching their torpedoes. Instead, they closed to gun range and fought as if they were battleships. The small ship that attacked first, the one we hit so many times, continued fighting even as it was sinking. Our doctrine has no answer for an enemy who does not fear death. How do you defeat a man who has already decided to die?" This psychological dimension of the battle, the impact of American audacity on Japanese decision-making, was as important as any tactical consideration. Kurita had been conditioned by years of war to expect American material superiority, but tactical caution. The U.S. Navy's standard practice was to engage from long range, using radar-directed gunfire and massed airstrikes to overwhelm Japanese forces without risking close combat. The idea that American destroyers would charge into a battleship formation, that they would continue fighting when hopelessly outgunned, violated every pattern Kurita had observed in 3 years of war. The result was a crisis of confidence. If the Americans were willing to sacrifice destroyers so readily, what else were they willing to sacrifice? If this small escort carrier group was defended so ferociously, what defenses awaited at Leyte Gulf itself? If Halsey's battleships were approaching, and Kurita had no way to verify or refute the radar report, could his battered, ammunition-depleted fleet survive the encounter? These questions, born of confusion and amplified by the fog of war, led Kurita to make the most consequential decision of the battle. At 0950 hours, with victory within his grasp, he turned away. The American landing forces at Leyte Gulf, defenseless and vulnerable, were spared. The Philippine campaign would continue, and the USS Johnston, sinking beneath the waves at that very moment, had achieved a victory far beyond anything her crew could have imagined. As Kurita's fleet steamed north, Japanese sailors looked back at the smoke-shrouded battlefield and tried to comprehend what had happened. They had entered the battle as hunters, confident in their superiority. They were leaving as survivors, grateful to have escaped. The psychological transformation was complete. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had once terrorized the Pacific, had been defeated not by superior force, but by superior will, by men like Ernest Evans and the crew of the Johnston, who had decided that some things were worth dying for. When death becomes inevitable, courage becomes infinite. The waters off Samar, October 25, 1944, 1,000 hours. The USS Johnston had slipped beneath the waves 15 minutes earlier, but her crew's ordeal was far from over. 141 men floated in the oil-slicked Pacific, clinging to life rafts, debris, and each other. Around them, the battle continued to rage. Aircraft screamed overhead, distant explosions rumbled across the water, and the smell of burning fuel oil hung thick in the tropical air. For these survivors, The fight for survival had only just begun. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the Johnston's gunnery officer, found himself in the water with a shrapnel wound in his thigh and a fractured collarbone from the final explosion that had destroyed the bridge. Around him, he counted perhaps 30 men in his immediate vicinity, some wounded, some in shock, all exhausted from 3 hours of continuous combat. Commander Evans was nowhere to be seen. Hagen would later learn that Evans, grievously wounded and weakened by blood loss, had gone down with his ship, refusing a life jacket so that a younger sailor might have it. "Listen up!" Hagen shouted, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "We need to get organized. Wounded men to the center of the group. Everyone else form a perimeter. Watch for sharks and stay together. The Navy knows we're here. They'll come for us." It was a lie, and Hagen knew it. The Navy had no idea where the Johnston survivors were. The battle was still ongoing, and rescue operations would not begin for hours, perhaps days. But the men needed hope, needed a reason to keep fighting, and Hagen would give them that reason, even if it was built on false optimism. The immediate threats were numerous and deadly. The water temperature was 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent hypothermia, but not warm enough to be comfortable over extended periods. The fuel oil coating the surface burned exposed skin and caused violent nausea if swallowed. Dehydration would become critical within 24 hours. And then there were the sharks. Pharmacist's mate, second-class John Mostowi, one of the few medical personnel to survive, began moving through the group of survivors, assessing injuries and distributing the meager medical supplies salvaged from the ship. He had a single first aid kit, waterlogged and missing half its contents. For men with compound fractures, sucking chest wounds and severe burns, Mostowi could offer little more than morphine and comfort. "How bad is it, Doc?" asked Seaman First Class Robert Billy, a 19-year-old from Texas who had manned one of the aft gun mounts. Blood seeped from a gash across his forehead, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Mostowi examined the arm, a clean break of the humerus, painful but not life-threatening if infection could be prevented. "You'll live, Billy, but that arm needs to be immobilized." Using strips torn from his own shirt and a piece of wooden debris, Mostowi fashioned a crude splint. "Don't move it, don't use it, and for God's sake don't let seawater get into that cut on your head." The survivors' situation deteriorated rapidly as the morning wore on. By 1100 hours, the battle sounds had faded into the distance. Admiral Kurita's fleet had withdrawn to the north. Taffy 3's carriers, battered but intact, had limped away to the south. The Johnston survivors found themselves alone in an empty ocean, with no ships in sight and no aircraft overhead. Chief Gunner's mate, Cletus Oberg, who had commanded Mount 51 throughout the battle, took charge of organizing the survivors into manageable groups. "We've got 4 life rafts and maybe 60 men in the water," he announced. "Wounded men get priority for the rafts. Everyone else, grab onto the sides. We stay together, we stay organized, and we stay alive." "Understood." The men responded with weak affirmations. Exhaustion was setting in. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the battle was fading, replaced by the crushing reality of their situation. Many had been awake for over 24 hours. All had endured the psychological trauma of combat. Some were beginning to show signs of shock, staring blankly at the horizon, unresponsive to questions. At 1200 hours, the first shark appeared, a 6-foot black-tip reef shark attracted by the blood in the water. Then another, and another. Within 30 minutes, a dozen sharks circled the survivors, occasionally bumping against legs and life rafts, testing for weakness. "Stay calm," Oberg shouted. "Don't splash, don't panic. They're just curious. If one gets too close, punch it in the nose or gills. We're bigger than they are. Act like it." But the sharks were not the only threat. At 1300 hours, Seaman Second Class James Mitchell began hallucinating, a symptom of dehydration and psychological trauma. "There's a ship," he screamed, pointing at empty ocean. "Right there. Can't you see it? It's the Johnston. She's come back for us." Mitchell tried to swim toward his imaginary rescue, thrashing in the water, attracting the attention of the sharks. Hagen and two other sailors grabbed Mitchell, wrestling him back to the life raft. "There's no ship, Mitchell. You're seeing things. Stay with us, stay focused." But Mitchell's breakdown was contagious. Within an hour, 3 more men began hallucinating, seeing rescue ships, Japanese submarines, or, in one disturbing case, their dead shipmates rising from the water to drag them down. The psychological toll of combat, combined with dehydration, exposure, and the constant fear of shark attack, was pushing men to the edge of sanity. Mostawi recognized the symptoms: acute stress reaction, what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. "We need to keep them engaged," he told Hagen. "Get them talking. Make them focus on something real. If they slip into catatonia, we'll lose them." Hagen organized the survivors into a call and response system. Every 15 minutes, he would shout a question. "What's your name? Where are you from? What's your rate?" And each man would answer in turn. It was a simple technique, but it worked. The act of speaking, of hearing their own voices, of connecting with their shipmates, kept the men anchored to reality. As the afternoon wore on, the survivors faced a new crisis: dehydration. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly, and the men had no fresh water. Some, driven by desperation, began drinking seawater despite warnings from Mostawi. The result was predictable: violent vomiting, accelerated dehydration, and in 2 cases, seizures that left men unconscious and barely breathing. "We need to find water," Hagen told Oberg. "If we don't, half these men will be dead by tomorrow morning." Oberg searched through the life rafts, hoping to find emergency water rations. He found 3 small cans of water, each containing perhaps 8 ounces, enough for 1 swallow per man, nothing more. It was a cruel calculus: distribute the water equally and give everyone a moment of relief, or save it for the most critically wounded and potentially save a few lives at the cost of morale. Hagen made the decision: give it to the wounded. Everyone else will have to tough it out. The decision was met with grumbling but no outright rebellion. The Johnston's crew had been forged in combat, had watched their shipmates die, had seen their commander sacrifice himself for their survival. They understood sacrifice. They understood that survival meant making impossible choices. At 1600 hours, 16 hours after the battle had begun, the survivors received their first stroke of luck. A rain squall moved across their position, bringing with it torrential rain and rough seas. The men tilted their heads back, opened their mouths, and drank greedily. They used shirts and pieces of canvas to collect rainwater, filling empty shell casings and tin cans with precious fresh water. For 30 minutes the rain poured down, and the men drank until their stomachs ached. The rain also brought relief from the sun and a temporary respite from the sharks, which seemed to retreat during the storm. But it also brought new dangers. The waves grew to 6 feet, threatening to capsize the life rafts and separate the survivors. Men clung to the rafts with cramping fingers, fighting to stay together, fighting to stay afloat. When the squall passed, Hagen counted heads. They had lost 2 men, one who had slipped away during the storm, too weak to hold on, and another who had been hallucinating and had deliberately swum away from the group, convinced he could reach a nearby island that existed only in his mind. The group was down to 58 survivors. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped, and the men began to shiver. Hypothermia, which had not been a concern during the day, now became a real threat. The survivors huddled together in the life rafts and in the water, sharing body heat, trying to stay warm. Some men sang old Navy songs, hymns, popular tunes from home. Others prayed. A few simply stared into the darkness, their minds retreating to safer places, to memories of home and family, and a world where ships didn't sink and men didn't die. Chief Oberg, his voice barely above a whisper, spoke to the men around him. "I want you all to know something. What we did today, what the Johnston did, that meant something. We stopped them. We saved those carriers. We saved the landing force. Thousands of men are alive tonight because of what we did. Commander Evans knew that. He knew we probably wouldn't make it, but he also knew it was worth it. So whatever happens out here, whether we get rescued tomorrow or next week or never, you remember that. We did our duty. We did it better than anyone had a right to expect. And I'm proud to have served with every one of you. The men responded with quiet affirmations, with tears, with embraces. They were no longer just survivors. They were brothers, bound by shared sacrifice, by shared trauma, by the knowledge that they had faced death and had not flinched. At 2200 hours, 20 hours after the Johnston had sunk, Seaman Billy, the young Texan with the broken arm, pointed toward the horizon. "I see a light," he said quietly. "Is that real, or am I losing it like Mitchell?" Hagen stared into the darkness. There, a faint light moving slowly across the water. "I see it too," he said, his heart beginning to race. "Everyone stay calm. If it's a ship, we need to signal it." The survivors had no flares, no signal lights, no way to attract attention except their voices. As the light drew closer, they began to shout, a ragged chorus of desperate men calling out to their only hope of salvation. "Here! We're here! Help us!" The light changed course, moving toward them. As it approached, the survivors could make out the silhouette of a destroyer, an American destroyer, the USS Dennis, which had been searching for survivors from the battle. Searchlights swept across the water, illuminating the oil-slicked faces of the Johnston's crew. "We've got survivors in the water," came the call from the Dennis's bridge. "All hands, prepare to recover survivors." Sailors from the Dennis threw lines and life rings into the water. They climbed down cargo nets to help pull exhausted men aboard. They carried the wounded on stretchers to the ship's sick bay. They wrapped the survivors in blankets, gave them water and hot coffee, and told them they were safe. As Hagen was pulled aboard the Dennis, his legs too weak to support his weight, a young ensign asked him, "What ship were you on?" "The Johnston," Hagen replied, his voice breaking. "DD 557. We fought them. We fought them all." The ensign nodded, his eyes filled with respect and something like awe. "We know, everyone knows. What you did today, what your ship did, that's going to be remembered. That's going to be in the history books." Of the Johnston's crew of 327 men, only 141 survived. Commander Ernest Evans was not among them. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The citation read, in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." Commander Evans fought his ship with such fury and determination that the enemy was thrown into confusion. But for the survivors, the medals and the citations would come later. On the night of October 25, 1944, as they lay on the deck of the USS Dennis, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by their shipmates, they felt only exhaustion, relief, and a profound sense of loss. They had survived the impossible. They had endured the unendurable, and they would carry the memory of the USS Johnston and the men who died aboard her for the rest of their lives. The moment the Imperial Navy realized it had lost the war, the heavy cruiser Tone limped northward through the Philippine Sea, her decks scarred by bomb hits and near misses, her crew exhausted and demoralized. In the cruiser's wardroom, Captain Haruo Mayuzumi sat with his senior officers, reviewing the action reports from the battle off Samar. It was October 26, 1944, one day after the engagement, and the full scope of what had transpired was only now becoming clear. What Mayuzumi read in those reports would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We fired over 800 rounds of 8-inch ammunition," Mayuzumi said, his voice hollow. "We achieved a hit rate of less than 3% against the escort carriers. Against the destroyers, our hit rate was higher, but even then we could not stop them. The small ship, the Johnston, we hit it more than 40 times with heavy-caliber shells, and it continued fighting for nearly 3 hours. How is that possible? His gunnery officer, Lieutenant Saburo Ishikawa, had no answer. The mathematics of naval warfare were clear. A destroyer displacing 2,700 tons could not survive sustained fire from cruisers and battleships displacing 10 to 20 times that tonnage. Yet the Johnston had done exactly that. More disturbing still, the Johnston had not merely survived, it had inflicted crippling damage on ships vastly more powerful than itself. Across Kurita's scattered fleet, similar conversations were taking place. On the battleship Yamato, Admiral Kurita met with his staff to conduct a formal after-action assessment. The statistics were damning. Center Force had entered the battle with 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. They had faced 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. By every measure of combat power, tonnage, firepower, armor, speed, the Japanese had possessed overwhelming superiority. Yet the results told a different story. The Japanese had sunk 1 escort carrier, the Gambier Bay, 2 destroyers, the Johnston and the Hull, and 1 destroyer escort, the Samuel B. Roberts. In exchange, they had lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk or crippled beyond repair, the Kumano, Chikuma, and Chokai, with 3 more cruisers damaged. More critically, they had expended over 60% of their armor-piercing ammunition and had failed to reach their primary objective, the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. Captain Abe, Kurita's chief of staff, summarized the situation with brutal honesty. "Admiral, we achieved a tactical victory. We sank more tonnage than we lost, but we suffered a strategic defeat. The American landing forces remain intact. Our ammunition is depleted. 3 of our heavy cruisers are gone. And the Americans now know that our fleet can be stopped by a handful of destroyers and escort carriers. The psychological impact of this battle will be profound." Kurita stared at the tactical charts spread across the table. He had replayed the battle in his mind 100 times, searching for the moment when victory had slipped away. Was it when the Johnston had launched its first torpedo attack, disrupting his formation and forcing his cruisers to maneuver defensively? Was it when the American aircraft had swarmed his fleet, forcing his ships to waste ammunition on anti-aircraft fire? Or was it when he had received the false report of American battleships approaching from the north, triggering his decision to withdraw? In truth, it was all of these moments and none of them. The battle off Samar had been lost, not through any single tactical error, but through a fundamental miscalculation about American will and capability. The Japanese had entered the battle expecting to face an enemy that would retreat when confronted with overwhelming force. Instead, they had encountered an enemy that attacked when retreat was the only rational option, that continued fighting when survival was impossible, that turned every disadvantage into an opportunity for aggression. "The Americans have changed," Kurita said quietly. "In 1942, they were cautious, defensive, afraid to risk their ships. Now they fight like us, like samurai, accepting death to achieve their objective. But they have resources we do not. They can afford to lose destroyers. They can afford to sacrifice ships and men. We cannot. Every ship we lose is irreplaceable. Every experienced officer who dies cannot be replaced. The mathematics of this war have turned against us." And the psychological impact of the battle rippled through the Imperial Japanese Navy with devastating effect. For 3 years, Japanese naval officers had been taught that their superior fighting spirit, their willingness to embrace death, gave them an advantage over the materially superior but spiritually weak Americans. The battle off Samar shattered that comforting myth. The Americans had demonstrated fighting spirit equal to or greater than the Japanese, and they had done so while maintaining the material advantages that made them ultimately unbeatable. Lieutenant Commander Hideo Fukumoto, the intelligence officer who had tried to make sense of the battle as it unfolded, wrote in his diary, "We have been defeated, not by American technology or numbers, but by American courage. The destroyer that attacked us first, the Johnston, embodied everything we believed was uniquely Japanese: the willingness to sacrifice, the refusal to surrender, the determination to fight to the last. But the Americans have these qualities too, and they have them in a nation that can build 100 destroyers for every one we lose. How do we fight such an enemy? How do we win a war against an opponent who combines our courage with their resources? The answer, though few Japanese officers were willing to admit it in October 1944, was that they could not. The Battle of Samar marked a turning point not in the military balance of the Pacific War that had been decided at Midway and in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign, but in the psychological balance. It was the moment when the Imperial Japanese Navy's officer corps began to understand at a visceral level that the war was lost. On the destroyer Yahagi, Captain Tamechi Hara gathered his officers to discuss the battle. Hara was one of the most experienced destroyer commanders in the Imperial Navy, a veteran of dozens of engagements, a man who had seen the full arc of the Pacific War, from the triumphs of 1941-42 to the desperate defensive battles of 1944. His assessment was bleak. "Gentlemen, I have fought the Americans for 3 years. I have seen them at their weakest, in the early days of the war, when they were confused and disorganized, and I have seen them at their strongest, as they are now. What happened yesterday was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration of how the Americans fight when they are confident, when they believe in their cause, when they are led by officers who understand that audacity can overcome material disadvantage." Hara paused, looking at the faces of his officers, young men, most of them, who had joined the Navy believing in the invincibility of Japanese arms. "The destroyer Johnston did something yesterday that I have never seen in 3 years of war. It attacked alone, without orders, without support, against a force that should have destroyed it in minutes. It was hit by shells from battleships and cruisers, shells that should have sunk it instantly, yet it continued fighting for 3 hours. It crippled 2 of our heavy cruisers, and when it finally sank, one of our destroyers saluted its crew. Do you understand what that means?" The officers remained silent, waiting for Hara to continue. "It means that the Americans have learned to fight our way. They have learned that ships are expendable, that lives are expendable, that only the mission matters. But unlike us, they can replace their ships. They can train new crews. They have an industrial base that produces destroyers faster than we can sink them. We have fighting spirit, but they have fighting spirit and unlimited resources. That combination is unbeatable." Hara's words were echoed in wardrooms across the Japanese fleet. The Battle of Samar had inflicted a psychological wound that no amount of propaganda could heal. Japanese naval officers, trained to believe in the superiority of their doctrine and the weakness of their enemy, had been confronted with undeniable evidence that their assumptions were wrong. The impact extended beyond the immediate participants in the battle. When news of the engagement reached the combined fleet headquarters in Japan, Admiral Somu Toyoda, the commander-in-chief, read the action reports with growing dismay. The Shogo Plan, the desperate gamble to destroy the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf, had failed. The center force had been turned back by a handful of escort carriers and destroyers. The southern force had been annihilated in Surigao Strait. The northern force had sacrificed 4 carriers as decoys, but had failed to draw away enough American strength to allow the center force to succeed. Toyoda summoned his staff and delivered a brutally honest assessment. "The Shogo operation has failed. We committed nearly every operational ship in the combined fleet, and we failed to achieve our objective. The Americans have landed at Leyte and will continue their advance toward Japan. We no longer have the strength to stop them at sea. From this point forward, our strategy must shift from offensive operations to delaying actions. We will make the Americans pay for every island, every mile of ocean, but we can no longer hope to defeat them in decisive battle. It was an admission that the war was lost, though Toyoda could not say so explicitly. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had begun the war with a stunning victory at Pearl Harbor, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, which had fought with desperate courage at Midway and Guadalcanal and the Philippine Sea, was now reduced to a defensive force, husbanding its dwindling resources, hoping only to inflict enough casualties to force a negotiated peace. The Battle of Samar had not caused this strategic collapse. That was the result of 3 years of attrition, of losses in carriers and aircraft and trained pilots that could not be replaced. But the battle had crystallized the reality of Japan's situation in a way that no previous engagement had done. It had demonstrated that American fighting spirit now matched Japanese fighting spirit, and that in a war of attrition between equals in courage but unequals in resources, Japan could not win. For the survivors of the Johnston and the other American ships that had fought at Samar, the psychological impact was equally profound, though in the opposite direction. They had faced impossible odds and had prevailed. They had charged into the teeth of a battleship fleet and had turned it back. They had demonstrated that courage and audacity could overcome material disadvantage, that the human spirit could triumph over cold calculations of firepower and tonnage. When the survivors of Taffy 3 returned to port, they were greeted as heroes. Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, issued a statement. The action of Taffy 3 off Samar represents the finest example of courage and determination in the history of the United States Navy. Outgunned and outnumbered, these ships and their crews stood their ground and defeated a vastly superior enemy force. The destroyer USS Johnston, in particular, displayed a level of audacity and fighting spirit that will serve as an inspiration to future generations of naval officers. But for the men who had fought the battle, the accolades rang hollow. They had lost shipmates, had watched friends die, had endured horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Robert Hagan, recovering from his wounds in a naval hospital, received a letter from the widow of Commander Ernest Evans. She thanked him for serving with her husband, for honoring his memory, for surviving to tell the story of the Johnston's last battle. Hagan wept as he read the letter. He wept for Evans, who had led them into battle knowing he would not return. He wept for the 186 men of the Johnston who had died. And he wept for himself, for the burden of survival, for the knowledge that he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain what had happened in those 3 hours off Samar, trying to make people understand what it meant to charge into a battleship fleet, trying to honor the memory of men who had given everything. The battle off Samar was over. But its legacy, the demonstration that courage could overcome overwhelming odds, that audacity could shatter an empire's will, that a single ship could change the course of history, would endure for generations. When a single ship's sacrifice became doctrine. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, November 15, 1944. 3 weeks after the Battle of Samar, the surviving officers of Taffy 3 assembled in a conference room at Pacific Fleet headquarters. Admiral Chester Nimitz, flanked by his senior staff officers, sat at the head of a long table covered with tactical charts, action reports, and damage assessments. The purpose of the meeting was to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the battle and extract lessons that could be applied to future operations. What emerged from that meeting would fundamentally reshape American naval doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. Nimitz opened the proceedings with a statement that captured the significance of what had occurred off Samar. Gentlemen, we have just witnessed something unprecedented in naval history. A force that should have been annihilated in 30 minutes held off a vastly superior enemy for over 2.5 hours and ultimately forced that enemy to withdraw. The Japanese had every advantage: firepower, armor, speed, numbers, yet they lost. We need to understand why. and we need to ensure that the lessons learned are incorporated into our tactical doctrine immediately. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of Taffy 3, stood to present his after-action report. His voice was steady, but those who knew him could detect the emotional weight he carried. Admiral, the survival of Taffy 3 was the result of three factors: aggressive destroyer attacks that disrupted enemy formations, effective use of smoke screens and rain squalls for concealment, and continuous air attacks that forced the enemy to divide their attention. But above all, it was the result of individual initiative by ship commanders who attacked without waiting for orders, who continued fighting when all hope seemed lost, and who demonstrated that audacity can compensate for material inferiority. Sprague paused, then continued. The USS Johnston, in particular, exemplified this principle. Commander Evans attacked alone, without coordination, at a moment when the enemy was most vulnerable, psychologically unprepared for aggressive action. His attack disrupted the enemy's formation, forced their cruisers to maneuver defensively, and created the impression that they faced a larger force than actually existed. The Johnston's sacrifice bought us time to launch aircraft, time to make smoke, time to survive. Captain Arleigh Burke, one of the Navy's most innovative tacticians and a future chief of naval operations, asked the critical question, can this be replicated? Can we train commanders to act with this level of initiative and aggression, or was Commander Evans an anomaly, a unique individual whose actions cannot be systematized? The question sparked an intense debate that would continue for months. Traditional naval doctrine emphasized coordination, careful planning, and adherence to established procedures. The idea of encouraging individual ship commanders to attack independently, to disregard standard protocols in favor of aggressive action, contradicted decades of naval training. Yet the Battle off Samar had demonstrated that in certain circumstances, individual initiative was more valuable than coordinated action. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans could not participate in this debate. He lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, along with 186 of his crew. But his actions spoke louder than any words could. In the months following the battle, the Navy conducted extensive interviews with the Johnston survivors, piecing together a detailed timeline of the ship's actions and Evans's decision-making process. What emerged was a portrait of a commander who had internalized the principles of aggressive destroyer doctrine to such a degree that his responses had become instinctive. Evans had not spent precious minutes calculating odds or waiting for orders. He had assessed the situation, recognized the threat to the carriers, and attacked immediately. His decision was not reckless. It was based on a clear understanding of destroyer capabilities, enemy vulnerabilities, and the tactical situation. But it was also audacious, willing to accept near-certain destruction in exchange for disrupting the enemy attack. The Navy's conclusion, formalized in a series of tactical bulletins issued in early 1945, was revolutionary. Destroyer commanders are encouraged to exercise maximum initiative in engaging enemy surface forces. When friendly carriers or capital ships are threatened, destroyers should attack immediately and aggressively, without waiting for coordinated orders. The psychological impact of aggressive destroyer attacks often exceeds their material effect. Enemy commanders, confronted with torpedo attacks at close range, will typically maneuver defensively, disrupting their formations and degrading their fire control solutions. A single destroyer, aggressively handled, can create confusion disproportionate to its actual combat power. This doctrine, born from the Johnston sacrifice, would be applied in the remaining months of the Pacific War. At Okinawa, American destroyers on radar picket duty would face massive kamikaze attacks and would respond with the same aggressive spirit that Evans had demonstrated. Many would be sunk, but their sacrifice would protect the carriers and battleships that provided air cover and fire support for the invasion force. But the Johnston's legacy extended far beyond tactical doctrine. The ship's actions had a profound impact on American naval culture, reinforcing values of courage, initiative, and self-sacrifice that would define the U.S. Navy for generations. The story of the Johnston became required reading at the Naval Academy, a case study in leadership under impossible circumstances, a reminder that material superiority meant nothing without the will to use it aggressively. Commander Ernest E. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor on November 8, 1944. The citation, read at a ceremony attended by his widow and children, stated, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of the USS Johnston, in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet during the Battle of Samar, October 25, 1944. The first to lay a smokescreen and to open fire as an enemy task force bore down on our transports, Commander Evans gallantly diverted the powerful blasts of hostile guns from the lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection, launching the first torpedo attack when the Johnston came under straddling Japanese shell fire. Undaunted by damage sustained under the terrific volume of fire, he unhesitatingly joined others of his group to provide fire support during subsequent torpedo attacks against the Japanese and outshooting and outmaneuvering the enemy as he consistently interposed his vessel between the hostile fleet units and our carriers. Despite the crippling loss of engine power and communications with steering aft, shifted command to the fantail, battled his desperately maneuvering ship for 2.5 hours. Finally sinking under the enemy's relentless firepower only after the men had been ordered to abandon ship. His valiant fighting spirit throughout this historic battle will venture as an inspiration to all who served with him. The Johnston herself received the Presidential Unit Citation, the Navy's highest unit award. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. In 1960, a former officer of the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze, the ship that had saluted the Johnston survivors, traveled to the United States to attend a reunion of Taffy 3 veterans. Through an interpreter, he delivered a message that brought tears to the eyes of the assembled survivors. "We were enemies in war, but we recognized in you the spirit of the warrior. The ship you called Johnston fought with a courage that transcended nationality. When we saluted your men in the water, we were acknowledging that courage knows no flag, that honor is universal, that some things are worth dying for. Your ship defeated us not through superior weapons, but through superior will. That is a lesson we have never forgotten." The technological legacy of the Battle of Samar was equally significant. The battle demonstrated critical vulnerabilities in Japanese fire control systems, which struggled to track small, maneuvering targets at close range. American naval intelligence analyzed the Japanese hit rates, less than 3% against the escort carriers, only slightly higher against the destroyers, and concluded that Japanese optical rangefinders and mechanical fire control computers were inadequate for modern naval combat. This analysis accelerated American development of radar-directed fire control systems, which would give U.S. ships a decisive advantage in night actions and poor visibility conditions. By 1945, American destroyers were equipped with fire control radars that could track multiple targets simultaneously and generate firing solutions faster and more accurately than any human crew could achieve with optical systems. The battle also validated the effectiveness of the Fletcher-class destroyer design. The Johnston and her sisters had proven capable of absorbing tremendous punishment and continuing to fight. Post-battle analysis showed that the Johnston had been hit by at least 40 shells, ranging from 5-inch to 14-inch caliber, yet had remained operational for nearly 3 hours. This survivability was attributed to the Fletcher-class's compartmentalized design, redundant systems, and the training and damage control skills of American crews. As a result, the Navy accelerated production of Fletcher-class destroyers, ultimately building 175 ships of the class, the largest class of destroyers ever built by the United States. These ships would serve not only through World War II, but through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and in some cases into the 1990s, a testament to the soundness of their design and the legacy of ships like the Johnston that had proven their worth in combat. For the survivors of the Johnston, the years after the war were a mixture of pride and pain. They had been part of something extraordinary, had witnessed courage that defied description, had survived when survival seemed impossible. But they had also lost friends, had seen horrors that haunted their dreams, had carried the burden of survivors' guilt. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, who had been pulled from the water by the USS Dennis, returned to civilian life and became a high school teacher in California. For 20 years, he never spoke publicly about the battle. Then, in 1964, on the 20th anniversary of the Battle of Samar, he was invited to speak at the Naval Academy. Standing before an auditorium filled with midshipmen, Hagen struggled to find words adequate to convey what he had experienced. "Commander Evans told us at the Johnston's commissioning that it would be a fighting ship," Hagen said, his voice breaking. "He told us he intended to go in harm's way, and he kept that promise. On October 25, 1944, we went into harm's way. We charged into a battleship fleet. We fought for 3 hours against impossible odds, and we won, not because we sank more ships than they did, not because we had better weapons or tactics, but because we refused to quit. Commander Evans refused to quit. The Johnston refused to quit, and that refusal, that absolute determination to keep fighting no matter the cost, that's what won the battle." Hagen paused, looking at the young faces before him. "Some of you will go to war. Some of you will face impossible situations. And when you do, I want you to remember the Johnston. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear. Remember that leadership is not about giving orders. It's about showing your people that you're willing to die for what you're asking them to die for. And remember that sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything." The midshipmen gave Hagen a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Many were in tears. They understood, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be a naval officer, what it meant to command a ship in combat, what it meant to ask men to follow you into certain death. The USS Johnston was never forgotten. In 1975, the Navy commissioned a new guided missile destroyer, DDG-31, and named it USS Johnston in honor of DD-557. The new Johnston served with distinction for 26 years, participating in operations from Vietnam to the Persian Gulf. When DDG-31 was decommissioned in 2001, the Navy announced that the name Johnston would be preserved for future use, ensuring that the legacy of Commander Evans and his crew would continue. In 2019, 75 years after the battle, a team of civilian researchers located the wreck of the USS Johnston in over 20,000 feet of water off the coast of Samar, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. Video footage showed the ship resting upright on the seafloor, her guns still trained toward the enemy, her battle flag still visible. The discovery brought renewed attention to the Johnston story and sparked a new generation's interest in the Battle of Samar. The final word on the Johnston's legacy belongs to Admiral Nimitz, who wrote in his official report on the Battle of Samar, "The action of the USS Johnston was the most gallant and heroic act of the Pacific War. Commander Evans and his crew demonstrated that the outcome of battle is determined not by the size of ships or the caliber of guns, but by the courage and determination of the men who fight. The Johnston's charge into the Japanese fleet will stand forever as an example of what free men can accomplish when they refuse to surrender, when they refuse to accept defeat, when they choose to fight against impossible odds because the cause is just and the mission is vital. This is the spirit that will win wars. This is the spirit that will preserve our freedom. This is the spirit of the United States Navy." On October 25th, each year, at naval bases around the world, American sailors gather to commemorate the Battle of Samar. They read the names of the 186 men of the Johnston who died. They honor the memory of Commander Ernest Evans, the Cherokee warrior who led his ship into legend. And they remember that on one morning in 1944, a single destroyer charged an entire fleet and changed the course of history. The story of the USS Johnston and the Battle of Samar stands as one of the most extraordinary examples of courage and determination in military history. A single destroyer, outgunned and outnumbered, charged into a battleship fleet and fought with such ferocity that it turned the tide of battle. Commander Ernest Evans and his crew demonstrated that the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, can achieve the impossible. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it reminded you that courage and sacrifice still matter in our world, please subscribe to this channel and share this video. The men of the Johnston deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told. And the lessons they taught us about leadership, about courage, about refusing to surrender in the face of impossible odds, deserve to be passed on to future generations. Leave a comment below telling us what you think. What would you have done in Commander Evans's position? How do we cultivate this kind of courage in our own lives? And what other stories from World War II should we explore? Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything.